Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. In Beckley, West Virginia, two people vanished without setting off alarms. There was no broken window, no emergency call, no frantic search party, just a mother and her 10-year-old daughter who were there one day and gone the next. What made this case different wasn't how they disappeared. It was how no one, not law enforcement, not family, not even the man who last saw them alive, could say with certainty where they went. For 2 decades, it wasn't a murder case. It was barely a missing persons file. And yet, 24 years later, the walls of a modest house would confess what everyone else had refused to admit. August 8, 2000. Susan Carter, 41, and her daughter Natasha, known to most as Alex, were temporarily staying with a longtime acquaintance. She was caught in a custody battle with her ex-husband Rick Lafferty and didn't feel safe at home. She needed a place to lay low while preparing to meet with Child Protective Services the following week. She never made that appointment. The original case file from the Raleigh County Sheriff's Office noted the timeline. Susan's car was found in the driveway. Her purse and daughter's backpack were missing. There was no known destination, no signs of forced entry or struggle, and no credible sightings in the days after. The last verifiable activity came from a grocery purchase made 2 days prior. Nothing else. At first glance, it looked voluntary. The working theory in 2000 was that Susan had fled with Alex to avoid losing custody. Several investigators admitted, years later, that the case lacked urgency from the start. No blood, no body, no signs of distress, one detective wrote in a supplemental report. Possible parental abduction. The file was closed within 10 weeks, the official status, absconded. But a few people didn't buy that theory. Susan's sister kept calling local authorities every few months. A case manager at the CPS office noted that Susan never missed scheduled meetings before. And Alex's elementary school reported that she hadn't picked up final report cards or transferred enrollment. There was no paper trail, no outgoing records, no forwarding address. In 2001, Alex was added to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children database. Her face appeared on missing posters alongside a digitally aged progression photo. Susan's profile remained largely static. No travel, no employment, no contact with known associates. Nothing. The house where they last stayed changed hands twice over the years. The first buyer never lived in it. The second turned it into a rental. In both transactions, the property was considered unremarkable. No one searched it again. No cadaver dogs, no forensic excavation, no structural scans. Because, as the report had said, no probable cause. It wouldn't be until 2021, over 2 decades after the disappearance, that the house would start speaking. In that year, the current owners began renovations on the second floor. When removing drywall from the back bedroom, the room where Alex had supposedly slept, a construction worker noticed a shallow indentation in the framework behind the far wall. He assumed it was structural settling, until his hammer dislodged a copper-jacketed projectile embedded deep within the wooden stud. The Beckley Police Department took the call. The projectile was turned over to the state crime lab, and a preliminary test found trace blood residue. DNA confirmation followed in early 2022. The sample matched Natasha Carter's profile, still preserved in the federal missing children database. The case, once cold, became an active homicide investigation. The forensic implications were immediate. You don't fire a gun inside a small bedroom and not leave more behind. And yet, there were no other visible bloodstains. No bullet hole in the drywall interior, no exit wound mark on the exterior side. Investigators noted that the hole had been patched from the inside at some point, likely before the house's first resale. Whoever had fired that round had both knowledge of where it landed and motive to hide it. A search warrant was issued, this time with updated forensics. Cadaver dogs, sonar imaging, and a structural team mapped out inconsistencies in the crawl space and yard elevation. Ground-penetrating radar found 2 subsurface anomalies behind the back fence line, but excavation wasn't approved yet, not without more evidence. The original resident of the home, Larry Webb, was still alive. Now in his early 80s, Webb had remained in the Beckley area under a different address. He had never left the region, never changed his name, and had no criminal history. At the time of Susan and Alex's disappearance, Webb was described as a quiet, retired widower who sometimes helped friends get back on their feet. The 2000 report listed him as the last person to see Susan and Alex, but no charges were filed. He told police then that Susan had packed up and left after an argument. When asked what it was about, he simply said money. He also claimed that Alex had seemed fine and that they drove away together late at night. No one ever verified that. When detectives re-interviewed Webb in 2023, he gave the same account. Verbatim, it was too clean. One investigator noted, "Most people remember things differently over time. His story didn't shift at all, and that's what bothered us." Forensic labs resumed trace analysis of all materials recovered from the 2021 projectile. Gunshot residue, material fragments, and surface damage were all mapped. An exact caliber was determined. The type of weapon it came from, a .38 special revolver, was common in the early 90s, but unusual to still be in use in 2000. Ownership records didn't link a registered weapon to Webb, but the real shift in the investigation didn't come from forensics. It came from the timeline itself. Investigators reconstructed a 72-hour window around August 8, 2000. A neighbor recalled porch lights being left on for 2 full nights after Susan's car stopped moving. A trash collection worker reported an odd chemical smell in the alley one morning, something between bleach and gasoline. Those leads weren't followed up at the time, but in 2023 they became key to reopening a possible burial zone. To this day, no 911 call was ever placed. No one reported screams, gunfire, or signs of a struggle. What this case lacked in noise, it made up for in silence. And that silence hid a double homicide for 24 years. By 2023, forensic teams had confirmed that a bullet lodged behind the drywall in a second-floor bedroom matched the DNA profile of Natasha Alex Carter. It was no longer a missing persons case. It was a double homicide, and it had been hiding in plain sight for nearly a quarter of a century. The room where that bullet was recovered was supposed to be a temporary refuge, a safe space for a mother and daughter caught in a legal crossfire. But forensic sequencing would tell a different story. It wasn't just the place she last slept. It was the place she died. In August 2000, Susan Carter had been in the midst of a contentious custody dispute with her ex-husband, Rick Lafferty. She'd filed for protection, citing alleged verbal aggression and instability. There was no formal restraining order in place, but documents from Child Protective Services indicated that Susan had expressed fear about losing her daughter permanently. She was actively attending meetings, working with case managers, and arranging supervised visitation. Everything pointed to a mother who was engaged, focused, and determined to retain custody. She needed a place to stay that week, a temporary one, somewhere off the radar, somewhere the custody attorneys wouldn't think to look. According to interviews from the original 2000 report, she told a friend she had arranged to stay with an old friend, someone safe. That friend turned out to be Larry Webb, a man described in the initial police file as a former neighbor and occasional helper. No formal relationship, no documented history of violence, no prior complaints. Webb then, in his late 50s, was known around Beckley as reclusive but functional. He owned his home outright, had no living spouse or children, and occasionally rented out rooms to acquaintances in need of space. He told officers in 2000 that Susan and Alex had stayed for just under a week before abruptly leaving. He claimed Susan had taken her daughter, packed the car, and said something about needing to disappear. That claim would later prove problematic, not because it sounded improbable, but because it left too many unknowns that Webb refused to clarify. He couldn't describe the exact time of departure. He couldn't explain what bags they took or whether they had made calls. He offered no witnesses and no concrete timeline. "They left," he said. "That's all I know." In 2000, without physical evidence, that story held. But in 2023, the focus shifted to verifying or disproving the environment where the last trace of Alex had been found. Specifically, the bedroom. A forensic architectural analyst was brought in. Using lidar scans and structural assessments, the team reconstructed the likely origin point of the fired round. It had been discharged from a downward angle, consistent with someone of adult height firing at close range into a much smaller person seated or lying down. The trajectory placed the shot as entering just above mattress level on the east wall. The wood stud that captured the bullet had been patched post-incident. Layers of paint confirmed it had been sealed up sometime between 2000 and 2003. That narrowing window of time coincided precisely with the house's first post-Webb resale. Additional forensic assessment of the floor beneath the drywall revealed minor heme-protein residue embedded in the subflooring. While faint, it confirmed proximity to bleeding, again localized directly beneath where the bullet had lodged. That ruled out the possibility of a misfire or incidental discharge. This wasn't an accidental shot into an empty wall. It had hit someone, and it had happened in that room. Backtracking from the site of forensic confirmation, investigators requested digital records to validate the 2000 timeline. While digital footprinting in that era was limited, a search through utility billing and property maintenance logs revealed that Webb had not used his landline for 4 consecutive days in early August 2000, a break in his normally consistent usage pattern. Moreover, neighbors' recollections, collected in a new round of interviews, painted a subtle but significant deviation in behavior. No porch activity, no lights on in the main bedroom, no signs of Susan or Alex after the 6th of August. One neighbor remembered seeing a pile of sheets or bags near the back shed 2 nights after the pair were last seen. At the time, she thought it was trash left for collection. The detail had never been included in the 2000 reports. In 2023, it became a possible burial lead. As evidence mounted, the timeline tightened. The bullet, the blood trace, the inconsistent landline record, and the newly uncovered neighbor statement collectively formed the foundation of a timeline that suggested Susan and Alex never left the house alive. And yet no autopsies had been performed, no death certificates issued, because until the bullet was discovered, no one had legally established a crime had occurred. This gap, the forensic limbo between suspicion and confirmation, represented the failure point of the original case. In many missing persons investigations from the early 2000s, the absence of overt violence meant the absence of urgency. Investigators often treated the disappearance of adult women as elective, unless there was immediate physical evidence to the contrary. And children who went missing with a parent were often classified under custodial interference rather than endangered status. This case exposed how those policies delayed justice. Had the bedroom been forensically swept in 2000, the blood trace might have been detected. Had the wall been scanned, the bullet would have surfaced. But the standards then were lower. The threshold for deploying expensive resources on a nobody case simply wasn't met. Only after advances in DNA profiling, structural forensics, and digital reconstruction became standard did the full story begin to form. Susan Carter hadn't disappeared to escape a custody battle. She'd been silenced. And Alex Carter, age 10, didn't run away. She died in a house no one searched. And for 2 decades, no one asked the right questions. In long-term cold cases, one red flag investigators consistently look for isn't what changes, it's what doesn't. When an individual tells the exact same version of events, word for word across decades, that consistency may seem reliable on the surface. But in real-world memory, details drift, timelines shift, and perception evolves. No story remains perfectly static unless it's rehearsed. In 2023, after the bullet behind the wall was matched to Natasha Carter's DNA and the blood trace beneath the bedroom floor confirmed the presence of trauma, investigators re-examined the original statements given by Larry Webb. At the time, Webb had told detectives that Susan and Alex left his home around nightfall on August 8, 2000. He claimed there had been no argument, no urgency, just a sudden decision to leave. Bags packed, no destination offered. When brought in for re-interview more than 2 decades later, Webb recited that same account, word for word. She said she needed to get out of town, he repeated, and that she'd call when things settled. That phrase, when things settled, was present in his 2000 interview transcript, his 2005 written statement, and his 2023 deposition. No variation, no elaboration. But the forensic timeline now painted a different reality. Susan never accessed her bank accounts again. Her vehicle remained parked in the same location, undriven. No outgoing calls were made from her phone. No bus tickets, no records of transit, no confirmed sightings in any jurisdiction. From a procedural standpoint, Webb's claim lacked foundational support. Investigators reviewed Webb's employment and behavioral history. He had worked as a maintenance supervisor for a local manufacturing facility until his retirement in 1996. He had no history of violence, arrests, or psychological holds. But he did have a pattern of isolation, limited social interaction, and a habit of tightly controlling his home environment. Several acquaintances noted that while Webb wasn't overtly hostile, he was rigid, domineering, and uncomfortable with others staying in his space for too long. One former tenant, contacted in late 2023, described Webb as paranoid about people touching his things. Another remembered being told to never go in the back shed, even during storms. While none of these statements provided direct evidence, they suggested a behavioral profile inconsistent with the hospitable demeanor Webb had projected in interviews. FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit staff were consulted to assess Webb's linguistic and psychological profile. Their report noted unusual narrative rigidity, an absence of emotional variation, and a tendency to speak in passive constructions, distancing himself from agency and consequence. For example, instead of saying Susan packed her bags, he repeatedly used phrasing like, they were packed, or things got taken. This passive voice, combined with the static nature of his recollections, pointed toward an intentional scripting of events, possibly to preserve a fabricated timeline. Further contradictions emerged when Webb was asked to reconstruct the day leading up to Susan and Alex's alleged departure. He claimed to have gone to the grocery store that morning, returned by noon, and then remained inside the house. But store surveillance footage from 2000, recently unearthed and digitized for high-resolution analysis, showed no image of Webb at the store that day. Nor were there any transactions linked to his known debit account at the time. That discrepancy prompted a re-examination of his landline call logs. On the day Susan and Alex were last seen, the phone registered no outgoing calls. Not to a cab service, not to relatives, not even to Susan's contacts. For someone who claimed Susan said she would call later, the absence of any facilitation for that communication raised suspicion. During his formal interview in December 2023, Webb was presented with the new forensic findings, specifically the DNA match to Alex in the bedroom and the blood residue on the subfloor. His reaction was subdued. He did not deny the findings. He did not express shock. Instead, he said, "I'm not sure how that got there." This statement, investigators noted, was the first break in his narrative. For the first time, he acknowledged that evidence may point elsewhere, but without assuming responsibility. From an interrogative standpoint, it marked a shift. Denial gave way to ambiguity. When asked if he was willing to submit to a polygraph, Webb declined. When asked to provide a DNA swab for exclusion purposes, he agreed, likely knowing that by then, it was no longer about comparison, it was about documentation. At this stage, forensic teams began mapping behavioral escalation indicators, a method used to chart psychological pressure against factual refutation. Webb's flat affect, repetition of language, and refusal to engage with new data suggested psychological compartmentalization. In practical terms, it meant he was likely aware of the events in question, but had isolated them from conscious engagement. That compartmentalization, however, began to erode when faced with compound evidence. In early January 2024, investigators returned to Webb's property under a judicial warrant to conduct ground sonar scans. While not yet a dig order, the approval allowed for surface mapping of soil disruption patterns. 2 thermal inconsistencies were identified behind the back fence, roughly 5 feet apart at shallow depth. When Webb was informed of the findings, his reply was terse. "You won't find anything," he said. But for investigators, it was no longer a matter of if, it was when. The decision to dig is never made lightly in a homicide case, especially when there's no body, no murder weapon, and the last confirmed evidence is 24 years old. But in January 2024, that threshold was met. After thermal imaging of the rear property showed 2 soil inconsistencies in the same quadrant, spaced approximately 5 feet apart and shallow in depth, law enforcement moved to secure a search warrant for excavation. This wasn't based on instinct or circumstantial speculation. It was grounded in cumulative physical evidence, trace blood proteins, ballistic trajectory, false statements, and now topographical irregularities. The backyard of the former residence at 416 Afton Drive, Beckley, was divided into grid sectors under FBI Evidence Response Team protocol. Grid B2, closest to the rear property line and directly behind the former tool shed, was the first to show heat differentials consistent with disturbed soil compacted over time. The radar data showed ground compression inconsistent with natural earth settling. That mattered. Natural settling patterns are predictable. These weren't. Surveying began under controlled conditions at 8:30 a.m. on February 2, 2024. A mobile forensic unit was stationed on site. Soil was removed layer by layer, recorded, photographed, and sifted. At 22 inches below surface grade, technicians encountered synthetic material consistent with aged bedding fabric. It was degraded but identifiable. Beneath it, human remains in partial skeletal state, folded in a fetal position and partially wrapped in decomposing cloth. A second body was found 38 inches away, in a similar position. The remains were intact enough for visual structural distinction. One adult, one child. The site was secured under federal jurisdiction. A medical examiner was flown in from Charleston for expedited field analysis. Skeletal imaging confirmed that the smaller remains belonged to a child approximately 10 years of age. Dental records later matched to Natasha Carter. The adult remains showed signs of healed bone stressors consistent with Susan Carter's medical history, specifically a prior wrist fracture noted in her 1996 medical file. Forensic odontology, mitochondrial DNA, and isotope analysis were initiated in parallel, not for doubt, but for procedural integrity. This wasn't about proving identity anymore. It was about establishing timeline, method, and cause. The grave itself told investigators more than anticipated. There was no coffin, no box, no preservation attempt. The depth was shallow, less than 24 inches. The soil above had been hastily compacted, not tamped. Vegetation above showed disrupted growth lines, suggesting the earth had been disturbed during a season with high moisture, likely late summer. That aligned with the original August 2000 disappearance. Notably, no personal belongings were recovered with the bodies. No clothing intact, no jewelry, no toys. A broken plastic clip with faded pink enamel, likely from a child's hair accessory, was the only object found between the layers. Forensics photographed and cataloged it, but it held no traceable DNA. Still, it confirmed something critical. These were not professional disposals. This was rushed. In cases involving concealed bodies on private property, proximity is considered an indicator of urgency and risk tolerance. The choice to bury both victims within 20 feet of the back door indicated a lack of time or fear. The conclusion was procedural. Whoever buried them didn't plan to move them later. They were meant to remain undiscovered. Autopsy reports followed a strict timeline. Within 5 days, cause of death for both victims was ruled as homicide by firearm injury. Alex Carter had a direct entry wound consistent with a close-range shot to the head. No exit wound. No other trauma. Her mother, Susan, presented a fractured rib and cranial damage. 2 impacts to the left parietal bone, suggesting blunt force prior to death, followed by a single gunshot to the torso. The lack of defensive wounds on either victim suggested they were caught off guard or overpowered quickly. Ballistic specialists compared the projectile recovered from the bedroom wall with markings on bone from both victims. Grooves matched to a single weapon, a .38 caliber revolver. Though the firearm was never recovered, the ballistic fingerprint confirmed it had been used on both victims. This was a controlled sequence. One shooter, one gun. At this point, the case transitioned fully into a confirmed double homicide. The Carter disappearance was officially reclassified, and both victims were entered into the National Violent Death Reporting System with cause and manner of death certified. Publicly, authorities withheld details of the excavation until families had been contacted and remains formally identified. Privately, the district attorney's office began preparing for criminal charges. The strategy was clear. While there was no living eyewitness to the murders, the combination of forensic reconstruction, conflicting suspect statements, and corroborated behavioral patterns was sufficient for a prosecutorial package. The case no longer depended on confessions. It rested on science. One line in the field report stood out. The remains were buried facing east, eyes downward. There's no legal relevance to body orientation, but in homicide documentation, details matter. It may not change the charge, but it reminds investigators what this really is. Not just evidence, but people. A mother, a child, buried under 24 years of silence, but not forgotten. By mid-February 2024, the Carter case had shifted from recovery to prosecution. Two confirmed victims. One bullet matched to both. A burial site within 20 feet of the suspect's former back door. For investigators, the challenge was no longer finding evidence. It was making sure none of it got lost in translation, especially to a jury who'd never heard of Susan or Natasha Carter until now. The Raleigh County District Attorney's Office began compiling the case file within 48 hours of the final autopsy reports. Every forensic document, ballistics, pathology, DNA confirmation, soil analysis, was scanned, indexed, and reviewed by an assigned prosecutor. Internal memos from the FBI warned of one issue: no weapon, no confession, no direct eyewitness. The evidence was overwhelming in pattern, but not in narrative. The question became not what happened, but who could prove it. A grand jury hearing was set for early March. Webb, now 82 and already in custody on unrelated weapons violations, had not been formally charged with the Carter homicides. That would require enough to indict. And by federal standards, circumstantial evidence, even layered across physical findings, must be presented with precision. Prosecutors needed not just data, but sequence. That's where forensic chronology became central. Analysts reconstructed the most probable sequence of events between August 6 and August 9, 2000. The key markers were Susan's last confirmed phone call on the 6th, utility silence beginning on the 7th, and Alex's school absence noted on the 8th. The grave depth, moisture patterns, and vegetation growth showed burial likely occurred on the night of the 8th or early morning of the 9th. Overlaying that data with Webb's statements revealed contradictions. He had told investigators repeatedly that Susan left in the evening, but offered no explanation for why her car remained, why her personal effects were never retrieved, why her daughter, a consistent school attendee, vanished without so much as a book bag. There were no packing signs in the house, no moving boxes, no evidence of a voluntary departure. By March 4th, the forensic pathology team submitted final interpretations. Alex Carter had been shot once, cleanly. No defensive wounds. Susan showed signs of blunt force trauma, possibly from a household object, before being shot. The team's conclusion: both were incapacitated before burial, and there were no indications either body had been moved after death. They died inside the house. They were buried behind it. They never left. Larry Webb's health had declined steadily since his booking. He was being held in medical detention at Mount Olive Correctional Complex. By late March, it became clear to prosecutors that the trial timeline had to accelerate. A plea deal wasn't an option. They had no confession, and Webb refused all further interviews. The only path forward was indictment and full trial preparation, regardless of Webb's physical condition. The grand jury met on March 12, 2024. The hearing lasted 6 hours. Key witnesses included the lead FBI forensic pathologist, the ballistic analyst, and the excavation lead. No sensationalism, no theatrics, just process. The panel returned a true bill that afternoon. Larry Webb was formally indicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder. What followed wasn't immediate closure. It was strategy. Prosecutors knew the trial might never happen. Webb's condition, while stabilized, was terminal. But the indictment allowed one thing: judicial authority to close the case. Legally, officially. That mattered. For the Carter family, it meant Susan and Alex were no longer just missing. They were victims of homicide, and someone had been named. As a procedural note, Webb was notified of the charges on March 18th. He didn't react. According to a prison nurse's report, he simply asked if his mail could be forwarded. He would die 35 days later, on April 22, 2024, before trial proceedings could begin. On the morning of April 22, 2024, Larry Webb was found unresponsive in his secured medical cell at Mount Olive Correctional Complex. He was pronounced dead at 10:30 a.m. Cause: complications of cardiac and pulmonary failure, consistent with his pre-existing medical decline. There was no note, no final statement, no appeal filed. The man at the center of a double homicide case, 24 years in the making, died before standing trial. With his death, the criminal process officially ended, but the forensic and procedural efforts did not. The FBI Evidence Response Team returned to the excavation zone for final recovery, documenting every remaining trace before the property was returned to civil ownership. This included additional soil sampling to test for chemical residue, consistent with reports of bleach and accelerant odors noted in witness statements from 2000. One sample, taken from the northwest quadrant near the fence line, revealed trace elements of sodium hypochlorite, standard household bleach, embedded within older sediment layers, undisturbed since early 2000s. It wasn't conclusive proof of scene sanitation, but it supported the timeline that cleaning had been attempted following the burial. In addition, residual fragments from the burial cloth were examined under electron microscopy. Fibers matched standard-issue twin sheets commonly manufactured in the 1990s. The pattern was cross-referenced with product distribution logs and identified as a batch sold regionally at a local department chain near Beckley, still active in 2000. It confirmed that the material was likely sourced from the residence itself. Again, nothing dramatic, just procedural reinforcement of what investigators already knew. The disposal wasn't planned with sophistication. It was fast, local, and intended to disappear into routine. A supplemental field report from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit emphasized one key point. The crime exhibited traits of reactive violence followed by opportunistic concealment. There were no signs of pre-staging, no burial tools purchased, no relocation efforts. Webb didn't attempt to flee, relocate, or assume a new identity. He remained in the same county, living less than 3 miles from the gravesite, for over 2 decades. It was a murder hidden not by evasion, but by indifference. After Webb's death, legal jurisdiction shifted to closure. The case file was marked exceptionally cleared, suspect deceased. While no conviction would be entered, the determination of responsibility stood. The forensic record remained open to public review, archived by the FBI and the West Virginia State Police. Susan and Natasha Carter were no longer classified as missing. Their names now appeared in the National Crime Information Center under confirmed homicide victims. A brief press conference was held on April 26, 2024. No sensational headlines, no speculation. Just a summary. Evidence was found, charges were filed, and the suspect died before adjudication. The most important statement came not from law enforcement, but from the Carter family spokesperson. We waited 24 years for answers. We never wanted revenge. We wanted the truth. The home where the crimes occurred was sold shortly after. The new owners were informed of the property's history under West Virginia disclosure statutes. No legal action was taken against them, and the backyard was filled, leveled, and reseeded. It became just another lawn on a quiet street. For cold case units, the Carter file will be cited in future trainings, not for complexity, but for persistence. It underscores the critical role of reevaluation, forensic consistency, and refusing to close a case just because time passes. Susan Carter wasn't just a missing person. She was a documented victim of domestic homicide. Her daughter, Natasha, wasn't a runaway. She was a child silenced in the one place she should have been protected. The case doesn't end with resolution. It ends with recognition. When a cold case closes without a trial, it doesn't end. It shifts. What follows is not court strategy or defense rebuttals. It's assessment. Forensic, procedural, institutional. The Carter case, though resolved outside the courtroom, became a procedural benchmark within months of its closure. Not for legal precedent, but for policy pressure. When a mother and child go missing and remain buried in a backyard for over 2 decades, despite early warnings and visible inconsistencies, it raises operational questions that no agency can afford to ignore. In June 2024, 6 weeks after Larry Webb's death, in the conclusion of field recovery, a federal task group on unresolved missing persons cases released a targeted review citing the Carter investigation as a case study in early procedural failure. The report was unsparing. It outlined 5 critical breakdowns: delayed crime scene processing, premature closure classification, lack of forensic reevaluation post-2005, failure to escalate from missing to endangered, and insufficient interagency communication between CPS and local enforcement. None of these elements were new, but the Carter case made them undeniable. The facts were blunt. Susan Carter had documented fears. She was actively engaged with state services. Her daughter's routine school attendance stopped abruptly, with no transfer request filed. Her car remained behind, and yet the original case was downgraded to voluntary absence within 10 weeks. That reclassification prevented follow-up for years. The FBI, in an internal training memo circulated in September 2024, designated the case under latent forensic signal, a term applied to disappearances where early evidence was subtle, overlooked, or improperly contextualized. The memo urged field agents to re-examine unresolved files involving women and children last seen in domestic settings, especially those with custody-related stressors and unexplained asset abandonment. At the state level, West Virginia's legislature initiated hearings into oversight gaps. One motion proposed was automatic forensic review of any custodial disappearance involving minors where the custodial parent cannot be located within 48 hours and where property is left behind. The motion did not pass committee in 2024, but led to the formation of a civilian liaison review board for missing persons cases involving minors. Their pilot focus: backlog files between 1995 and 2010. Nationally, the case revived scrutiny on how agencies interpret absence. The Carter investigation reinforced a point advocates had long pushed. Disappearance should not be the absence of presence, it should be the presence of disruption. When bank accounts are untouched, appointments missed, and personal effects abandoned, it is not enough to assume departure. It demands escalation. The forensic community also took stock. At the 2024 American Academy of Forensic Sciences Conference, a session was held on micro-level ballistic analysis in historic residential structures. The Carter case was used as a primary model for identifying embedded rounds using wall scans and updated imaging methods. This stemmed directly from the discovery in 2021, where a single unreported projectile changed the entire trajectory of a 20-year-old file. From a law enforcement standpoint, the case reframed priorities in training. Entry-level detectives were briefed using case modules built around Carter and similar failures. The message, silence is not confirmation, absence is not proof of consent, and familiarity with the suspect is not a reason to assume safety. For families of the missing, none of this undoes the loss, but it does change the language used around it. The Carters are no longer an open question. They are not a mystery. They are an example, one that, according to a West Virginia cold case officer, should have never gone cold in the first place. By the time the excavation closed and the case file was sealed, the Carter family had already begun funeral preparations. Susan and Natasha were laid to rest in May 2024, 24 years after they were last seen alive. The service was private. No press, no podium speeches, just names spoken out loud for the first time in decades. Not in search bulletins, not in case briefings, but in remembrance. There was no trial to broadcast, no courtroom statement to finalize a narrative. But there was certainty, forensic certainty, legal certainty, emotional certainty for those who had waited long past what anyone should. Susan wasn't unstable. She wasn't running. Natasha wasn't abducted by her father, or hidden, or lost. They were killed in a house they had trusted, and for 24 years their absence was ignored under the guise of presumed choice. At the burial, Natasha's former teacher placed a folded paper flower at the base of her headstone. It was the same type she used to make in third grade. Quiet, intricate, precise. The kind of thing easily overlooked, but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Much like the investigation itself, the broader community of Beckley, West Virginia, didn't hold vigils or protests. There were no marches. But something did change. Missing persons reports that came in after the Carter file closed were handled differently. Officers followed up sooner. Custody disputes were flagged for mandatory welfare checks. New detectives were trained with case modules that included the Carter timeline, not for how to find bodies, but how to stop failing to notice them in the first place. Within investigative circles, the case was formally archived under Unsolved Resolved, a designation used when the prime suspect dies before conviction, but where evidence meets prosecutorial thresholds. The Carter case was cited in at least 4 internal law enforcement symposiums in late 2024, particularly for its demonstration of latent scene evidence, ballistic trajectories and subfloor residues missed during initial scene walkthroughs, but recoverable years later with updated techniques. For family members, those technical acknowledgments meant little. They mattered to the field. But grief doesn't operate in procedural terms. What mattered was acknowledgement. That Susan wasn't negligent, that Natasha didn't run, that their names were finally placed somewhere official, 2 headstones side by side under their full legal names. No one called it justice. The man responsible died before trial. There were no formal convictions, no sentencing, no recorded admission of guilt. But there was closure, not the kind the system promises, but the kind reality offers when nothing more can be done. It's easy to talk about missed red flags in hindsight. Easier to say someone should have looked harder, sooner. But what the Carter case made clear is that systems don't fail because people don't care. They fail because people assume. They assume adults leave. They assume children follow. They assume quiet means safe and that a lack of violence means peace. The Carter file is a reminder that violence doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's passive, sometimes it's buried. The message isn't about blame, it's about vigilance, about remembering that gone isn't the same as safe, and that no person should disappear without someone being held accountable for why. In the end, the Carter case is not remembered for its twist or spectacle. It is remembered because silence lasted too long, and because evidence, when finally uncovered, spoke louder than the man who buried it. I've told you this story not just to share what happened, but to remind you of what should never happen again. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Silence can be deadly. We can't afford to dismiss red flags or explain away someone's disappearance just because it's inconvenient to dig deeper. Susan and Natasha deserved better. And if telling their story keeps even one more case from going cold, then it matters. What do you think this case says about how we treat missing persons? Should law enforcement protocols change? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from or how this story made you feel. If this video moved you, even just a little, please hit subscribe. That way you won't miss the next story, and maybe together we'll help someone else be heard.